Are you ready, sir?
I am.
All right. So, welcome. Today we have Gary Noesner over here, the author of Stalling for Time: My Life as an FBI Hostage Negotiator. I am so thrilled to have you, Gary, on board. My name is Luis Ramirez, as you know, from the Conversation Podcast. I'm pretty sure that I could introduce you, but I would like to give you the floor in a couple seconds. I know you were with the FBI for roughly 30 years. Then you went into private consulting as well. You started your own company, National Consulting Company, and also now you obviously have this fabulous book about negotiation, hostage negotiating, and it's called Stalling for Time. I'll give you the floor. That way you could make sure you get introduce yourself. I know you do a better introduction than I just did, but go right ahead, sir.
Well, thanks, Louise. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Yeah, I mean, I joined the FBI right out of college. It was a lifelong ambition to join the FBI, and I was fortunate enough my childhood dream came true, and it was a great career. I still look back at it with amazement of the many things I was able to do and the kinds of high level, often cases and national and international attention that it was involved in. So that was a great privilege. Certainly, the family had to make sacrifices with my travels and so forth. But it was a great career. I worked as a criminal investigator. I worked foreign counterintelligence. Spent a lot of time working terrorism, and in addition, I was a hostage negotiator, and later became a full time hostage negotiator, and eventually the chief negotiator for the FBI. So the last 23 years of my 30-year career, I was the chief negotiator for the FBI and involved in a lot of prison riots and right-wing militia standoffs, religious zealot sieges, embassy takeovers, hijackings, skyjackings, the normal stuff. And
The normal stuff.
yeah, the normal stuff. And in a lot of less cases of less notoriety. So from that, I obviously learned a great deal about dealing with people in crisis and using communication skills to resolve conflicts so we wouldn't have to use force to do so. And that's the reason when I retired in 2003 and I began work as a kidnap consultant for a private international risk consultancy. And then after doing that full time for 5 years, I was counseled to write my book, and I did, and was kind enough that Random House engaged me to write it, and the book did real well, and eventually was used as part of the basis for the Netflix Paramount Network show on Waco, the six-part miniseries that came out actually 2 years ago, but just was in the last month released on Netflix, and has certainly reopened a lot of discussion and interest in Waco. But yeah, it's just one thing that I talk about in my book. I talk about a lot of other cases and the importance of creating a relationship of trust in order to influence people and steer them away from violence towards cooperation. So it's kind of me in a nutshell.
In a nutshell, I love it. So there's a lot of stuff that you actually went through, and I was fascinated by reading through your book because as I know as a child we all have dreams as far as being a police officer or a NASCAR race driver or going up to space. But you knew exactly what you wanted to do, and you went ahead and did it. It was fascinating, and maybe you could just share a little bit of the story. You basically were watching the Mickey Mouse club. Right now, it's called the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse. I have a 3-year-old, so I get the terminologies confused. Back in the '50s, it was known differently, right? What was it known
I
as?
think it was just called the Mickey Mouse Club, and it was. So I actually have it wrong in my book. I said I was 12 years old, and I gave a speech a few years ago, and as a gift, the conference owners found a tape of the original Mickey Mouse show,
I was looking for that. I spent
and it's 1958. So I was 8 years old, 7 or 8 years old when I saw this episode, and it
okay.
was the in addition to it was a child's variety show. They showed cartoons. They had you know Davy Crockett and Spin and Marty, and it was just a show that kids my era watched after school. And in one particular series of episodes, they went and visited the FBI headquarters, and even interviewed J. Edgar Hoover, who was still alive, obviously, until the early 70s. And listening to them talk about the FBI, how prestigious it was, how difficult it was to become an FBI agent, how important the work was chasing spies and going after mobsters and organized crime and political corruption and all of those things, it just clicked something in me. And then the piece de resistance was when they went to the firearms range and shot the Thompson machine gun. And I just
You,
thought,
you, so you got to see that.
yeah, I
That
got to see that. I mean, that was, in the old days, the FBI actually carried those machine guns. They quit doing that long before I became an agent, although we were able to shoot them in a nostalgic way. But it is something about the the job of being an FBI agent just attracted me. And my mother came home from work that day, and I told her about it. Told her I'd had this epiphany, even though I didn't know what an epiphany was. And she was a good mom, and she went out and she bought me a young kid's book about the FBI, and I read it and 100,000 times, and that's all I ever wanted to be. And I went to college. I wasn't sure if I could get in the FBI, so I got a teacher's certificate in addition. And but eventually, I was able to get in the FBI and pursue my dreams, and it sure didn't disappoint.
for sure. So 1958. So I tried actually looking for that. So do you have access to that video
Yeah,
or
yeah. I think they. I don't have all of them. They gave me one that it actually. I don't think it's the actual episode I want, but it was in the series. And yeah, it was pretty interesting to look back at that, and because I hadn't revisited since I was 8 years old. So
for sure?
yeah,
So speaking on revisiting, let's revisit something else that I found a little bit. I had to do some research because when I saw that you wanted to be a G-man, I was like, "Oh, is that for Gary?" I'm like, "He was already a G," but I was like, "No, that can't be it. Let me research a little bit." And it turns out to be a government agent for the FBI, right?
yeah. It's a term that I don't think it was Al Capone. It was one of the famous gangsters. It just escapes me now which one it was. Machine Gun Kelly,
Okay,
John Dillinger, one of those famous gangsters. From the Depression era before the war. Uh, you know, Made a public comment about being chased by the G-men, being the government men, and that stuck. And if you go back and look at a lot of the literature about the FBI from the 50s and 60s, and even a little bit beyond, it was quite common to see the term G-man used to denote FBI agents. So it was a description that we took some pride in, actually. So it wasn't a pejorative.
for sure. Um, so I know that as a chief hostage negotiator, um, what is negotiation? Because a lot of people they I know for sure. I think that people negotiate every single day. Like I said, I have a 3-year-old. I think I'm negotiating. I'm refining my skill sets with him all the time. I also have a 12-year-old, and it's different how you negotiate with a 3-year-old, an 11-year-old. And I'm mentioning that because you have to know your audience when you're negotiating. I mean, I'm speaking to, I'm preaching to the choir over here, but I want you to get into what is negotiation, what is not, and also I think how you approach uh, different audiences, right? And maybe we could start there and then let it roll into the conversation about what you did before as a hostage negotiator.
Yeah, I mean, I think yeah, when if you go on Google and you search negotiations, you're more likely to find a ton of things on business negotiations, on closing deals and making
Yeah,
sales and so forth and so on. But I look at negotiation far more broadly than that. It's basically interpersonal communications. It doesn't necessarily mean you come to an agreement. That's usually the goal, but it's we all do it as you suggested every single day of our lives. Sometimes without realizing it, we make compromises. We listen to other people's challenges. We acknowledge them, and so forth and so on. So back in the early '70s, the New York City Police Department we came up with the original idea of hostage negotiations, and rather than the police just storming into a robbery where people are holding hostages and start shooting and endangering everyone's lives, including their own, they said maybe we should just contain the situation and open up a dialogue and see if we can convince them to, surrender peacefully. And the FBI recognized immediately the great value in that approach, and we stole it lock, stock, and barrel, and we had the resources to really expand on the psychological components of it, and we began to not only teach it around the world in the United States, but we began, because of our national position, to collect data what various police departments were doing, what worked, what didn't work, what obstacles we faced, and so forth. And so through time, starting back in essentially the mid '70s, the discipline really began to grow. Early on, it was used almost exclusively in a hostage situation, which I have to define a little bit. A hostage is someone held for the fulfillment of a substantive demand made upon a third party. So basically, there's something I want. I can't get it. I want a plane to take me to Europe. I want my brother released from jail. I want $1 million. Whatever it is I want, I can't get it on my own. So by holding a hostage and threatening that hostage's life, I feel like I am empowered to compel or make you do what I want. The concept of negotiations in those early days was to basically make that perpetrator work for everything they got. They never got anything unless they gave us something back. Well, you're hungry in the bank. I can understand it. You've been in there 7 hours, but I can only get you some food in there if you let one of those hostages go. It was that kind of quid pro quo, a term bantied around quite a bit in the news recently, but it was that sort of relationship that was really fostered and taught to police officers. What I think we did, and the big role I think the FBI played, and I was a big part of that, I'm proud to say, back in 1990, we stole again, this time from the mental health counseling field. And we stole a group of skills they'd been using, started by Carl Rogers, and that's active listening. And by that, we began to realize that 90% of the situations police negotiators were responding to were not even technically hostage situations. There were people being held and threatened, but there was no substantive demand made in return for their release. It was just an angry spouse, a disgruntled worker, whatever it might be, somebody who was demonstrating anger, frustration, often senseless and self destructive. We found in those situations, again, 90% of what cops continue to do this day, to be best served when we applied these non threatening active listening skills. And by that, we mean listening is not a passive endeavor, it's an active one. When you tell me about a problem or a concern or an issue, I don't just nod my head and go, or say, I understand. I demonstrate I understand because I will, come back and feed back to you what I've heard, and what you've just said and how it's impacting you and how you feel about it. And what we've learned and what mental health counselors learned long before us was it's a powerful way to create a relationship that proves you understand. A lot of people are engaged in some of this activity because they feel that in their lives no one is listening, no one understands or appreciates what they're going through. So instead of having this police officer show up and say, you better do what we say or else we're going to come get you, and we're going to enforce the law, we don't care what you do. What we say is, hey, my name's Gary. I don't tell them I'm an official or have a title. I just say, I'm Gary, I'm here to help you. It sounds like you're really going through a really difficult day, and you're really angry at your boss and you don't feel like he's treated you right, and I'd like to see if maybe you and I could try to come up with a solution where you don't get hurt and nobody else gets hurt. It's that soft, empathic, understanding voice that helps the person lower their emotional level and begin to think and behave in a more rational basis. That's really the key to success. And starting in about 1990, our FBI crisis negotiation courses, and that's why we changed the name from hostage to crisis negotiation to reflect the broader application of these skills, not just to hostage situations. So we started to use and teach these skills to better equip police officers with the tools they needed to really diffuse tense and difficult and often quite dangerous situations and achieve better outcomes. And we do this primarily because we certainly don't want innocent victims hurt. We don't want perpetrators hurt. But most importantly, we don't want police officers hurt. So if we don't have to go into a building and confront someone, who has a dangerous weapon and poses a threat and may act very defensively to any efforts we undertake, now if we can convince them that it's to their advantage, it's to their benefit to put their weapon down and let the other person go and come on out, then that's just essentially a win-win for everybody. So we don't have to trick them, we don't have to fool them, we don't have to lie to them. I'm not saying that never happens, but essentially it's about creating a relationship of trust, and it works in quite an amazing way. And it's been validated, thousands of times over. And so I think that's the big shift. When I first started teaching those skills in 1990, I could go to a big negotiation conference and I could ask, how many of you are aware of active listening skills? And out of, three or 400 people, you might get a handful of arms raised. That's it. Now you can't go to, there's a couple dozen big negotiation conferences around the States. You can't go to any of them without asking that question, and essentially everybody raises their hand. This is the bread and butter of the industry. And I'm proud that we helped to make that widespread and help equip officers to keep themselves safe, number one, and number two, to resolve situations with the least amount of force necessary.
Now, is it safe to assume that that active listening is a challenging skill set to acquire or develop if you don't have that innate
Yeah,
ability to actually have that relationship mindset?
I think there's some people that are just absolutely brilliant at it naturally. I mean, they're just really good listeners. When you're talking to them, you're doing it to me now. You're giving me great eye contact.
Oh,
You're
thank
giving
you.
facial gestures. You're conveying to me that you're listening to what I'm saying and you understand it. And I can tell you understand it because I see your facial expressions change when I'm saying something that resonates with you. So those are powerful, powerful tools. Again, some people are quite natural at it. There are some people that are just god awful at it and probably will never be any good at it. And they're not all politicians, by the way. No, just joking there. But it's kind of like a bell curve, But I think 50% of us in the middle, not that 25% who are natural or the 25% who will never get it. Most of us, if we uh, pay attention to the training and work on the skills and genuinely and sincerely try to deploy them in a setting, we're going to be successful. And it even works, and that's what my book is about, is taking those lessons we learned in law enforcement and applying them to life. I mean, if you can convince someone that's killed somebody already to surrender, well, certainly you should be able to have a pretty good conversation with your coworker that you're having a disagreement with.
Sorry, I see you already had. Sorry for interrupting you. I just wanted
No,
to
no, I'll interrupt. You can interrupt me for a book plug anytime.
no, no, no. It's because there's a plethora of information that you shared over here, which again, the book focuses a lot on a lot of the cases that you've worked. But I found, besides the Waco situation and besides the Jordan situation, besides the prison situation, the one that really struck me was the one where now you're dealing with one of your own, where the police officer, I forgot his name now. Sorry, the police officer ended up uh, keeping people hostage. Ended up shooting a person immediately as soon as he walked into I think it was a bank where his wife worked.
Yeah,
Um,
Houma, Louisiana.
yes, sir. Yes, sir. And if somebody would have just, if I don't want to point fingers and play armchair quarterback here, but he was saying, "Hey, I want to talk to somebody. I want somebody to listen." And I think that's one of the things that you said here is that active listening is listening to that individual. And he was saying, "I want to speak to somebody," and then you have this young, Go Charger FBI agent. She was also negotiating. She went through your training, and she stepped in and she showed empathy. She showed the active listening, and she just pretty much de-escalated the situation. And I think that case right there pretty much illustrates the majority of the things that you just mentioned over here, as far as the active listening, how to demonstrate, how to, the individual just shot somebody. How do you control to in your so I guess what I'm trying to say is that in your mind, you're like, WTF, right? How are we going to resolve the situation? Because number one, he's a law enforcement agent. He knows the consequences of what he just did, and he just did it. Now it's just, we could go back to Charlie, how you started the book with Charlie. So to me, I guess I have so many questions to ask here, but walk me through that where it's just like now you have your playbook, quote unquote, if you had one or have one, and now you're like looking through this through the chapter by chapter, and was there something in there to talk through a police officer that just shot somebody that he or she knows the consequences, and how do we resolve this by not having any more fatalities per se, and maximizing, for the lack of a better term, maximizing or minimizing the lack of the consequences that he or she, for this case the police officer, was going to have afterwards if he or she lives and gets arrested, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the case in point that you're discussing happened in a bank robbery in Houma, Louisiana. The police were basically confronting just a terrible situation. The police officer on duty had raped a woman and gave her his business card, which
Yeah.
I think any Sigmund Freud would tell you that he knew the consequences of what he was doing, and by giving her his business card, he was basically conveying this was probably going to be the last day of his life, and he expected to be caught and um, the situation to end violently, probably with a suicide. So he goes from that rape to the bank where his wife works as a teller. They're having marital difficulties, divorce. I can't remember what stage they were in, but it was acrimonious for sure. And he takes over the bank, the employees, and some uh, customers, and he kills a customer right away. And he doesn't know her. He just shoots and kills her. And in my business, that means he's increasingly taking steps that he knows he cannot step back from. This has locked him in an ultimate course of action, which clearly was looking to be an additional homicide followed by a suicide. So the police were left with a really, really challenging situation, to say the least. But when you're talking to a perpetrator like that, and if they're willing to discuss or talk with you, and they say, I want to talk, and you say, we'll talk as soon as you come out, you're missing the boat. If they want to talk, talk right then, talk immediately, and begin to create that relationship. Most perpetrators do not surrender unless they have some confidence and faith that the negotiator is genuine, sincere, honest, trustworthy, isn't going to say one thing and do something else. And so to create that relationship that prompts them to come out, we have to have an opportunity to demonstrate that we're worthy of their respect, and we do that by being attentive to them, listening to the problems and concerns and issues that they have right then, right now. And ultimately, we get to a point where they're more likely to listen to our advice about putting their weapon down and come out. That's exactly what he did. But I think I'm not here to criticize the police, but I think their initial thinking was, "Hey, come on out, then we can sit down and talk." And my counsel is always talk to him when he wants to talk, anytime he wants to talk. It's the way for us to create that uh, relationship to allow us to influence behavior. So, I mean, that is basically how the process works. We're not successful 100% of the time. There are people who have engaged in activities and whose psychological makeup or life condition is such that they probably made a choice that this is not going to end well. But in an overwhelming majority of them, if we can keep from escalating the situation, if we can keep from not appearing aggressive or threatening, we stand a very good chance to change the dynamics of what's going on. And once we've heard the person articulate what issues he has, what concerns, how he feels about what's happened to him in life, once we have gotten more information on that, and at the same time establish a relationship. And we can begin to say, well, you might think about doing this. Or we sometimes will have them say, Gary, I just don't know what to do. Well, to me, that's an invitation now that I have earned the right now to make some suggestions to this person. You know, one of the interesting thing is in all the cases I was involved in, we used to typically ask the perpetrator what what was said that made you come out. What did the negotiator say? What did I say? Whoever it was.
After the fact, right?
After
After
the
the fact.
fact, yes, after the fact, after they've
Okay.
surrendered.
Yeah,
I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear. And
that's
the
fine.
answer is always exactly the same. And it's surprising, but very insightful. And the answer is, I don't remember what you said, but I like the way you said it. And you really think about that for a moment, your tone, your demeanor, your likability. I mean, these are powerful tools. I teach business conferences and speak at conferences, and you know, it's great to have this strategy of how we're going to go in with a price that's high or low, and how we're going to maneuver versus the other company or whatever it might be. And I'm not saying that's bad stuff. That's great. Let the business gurus delve in that realm. But for me, it's all about wanting to do business with people you like and respect, and people that you feel are genuine and trustworthy. Everything in life, dealing with your young children, dealing with your spouse, your coworkers, people you serve with in the military, whatever it is, it's all about relationships. Everything
That's true.
is. And if you're successful at building those and sustaining those, you're going to be successful in life,
That's true.
plain and simple. I think what's the great book, Emotional Intelligence, talks about this a little bit. It's not necessarily the person with the highest IQ or the best SAT scores that is successful in life. Rather, it's the person that has these empathic capabilities to work together collegially on a team, to listen to other people's inputs, to do as what Stephen Covey, the business guru, says: first seek to understand and then to be understood. These are all interesting ways to express the same point about I have to earn the right to be of influence with someone else. I don't get it just because I'm an FBI agent or I carry a gun or a badge. I have to I have to earn it through my behavior.
That's true.
And as a young FBI agent, I would see agents and police officers who were just amazing at street psychology. They could avoid a tough situation turning into a dangerous one by the way they spoke to people and the way they engaged with them. And then I worked with other agents, police officers who were just terrible. And we'd always end up getting in a, we'd roll around the ground and, wrestle somebody and handcuff them and all this kind of nonsense. I learned to copy the people that knew how to talk to people because, I couldn't afford that many suits. And so, uh, so, you learn those skills, and it's the smart way to do it. Being a police officer and a detective or an FBI agent, it's about getting information and getting cooperation and getting people to do what we would like them to do, to get them to help us, to get them to cooperate. And if we employ these skills properly, we greatly enhance the chances of achieving that outcome the way we want it to be.
So I want to press on that leadership aspect a little bit later on, but I want to ask you about a question that I want to get your insight on because you did mention influence a couple minutes ago, and I was having a conversation with my wife about convincing, persuasion, and influencing, and I said I recall vividly when I was in the Marine Corps. I was in the Marine Corps security duty. So I went to Moscow. I served in Moscow, Russia for a year. In Bosnia, Sarajevo for 2 years, and we had a lot of de-escalating classes, de-escalating techniques, right? How to de-escalate situations, especially when you have somebody in front of you that's speaking a whole different language. I don't look Russian. I don't look Bosnian. So these are really interesting skill sets that I've cherished from the moment that they taught me this stuff. And I know that a smile goes a long way, eye contact goes a long way, body language is huge, especially when you're trying to defuse the situation, right? Obviously, we were all in uniform, and that speaks for itself. you don't have to verbally say, there's verbal and nonverbal. Um, but I guess I'm beating around the bush over here. The question I have, not a question, but just your insight: convincing, persuading, and influencing. They all have obviously different meanings, and I think you could utilize those components in different ways. But I just want to hear from your perspective. 30 years in the negotiating business, um, or just in the FBI per se, and then obviously negotiating as well. What's your take on those three right there?
I think what makes you effective in achieving your goal in a communication and negotiation, in the first thing we teach negotiators is self-control.
Yeah.
If you can't control your own emotions, how can you begin to think that you can influence someone else's? So your demeanor uh, carries an awful lot of influence in any situation. You know, it's tough. You're wearing that Marine Corps uniform in front of the embassy, and you've got all the symbolic representations of our country. And by the way, my travels around the world, I've interfaced with many of your colleagues, and was always very, very proud of them
Oh, thank you,
and
sir.
how they represent our country. I can't tell you. Anyway, um, so you've got the symbols of your position there, but you can overcome that if it's viewed as a negative through exactly what you said: your smile, your posture, your openness, your willing to be flexible rather than absolutely rigid about everything. Sir, you will stand there, and it's tough for the Marines because of the training and the uniqueness of the Corps. But sometimes you have to drop that official military or law enforcement voice, and we know there is one, and try to be just more natural sounding, more down to earth. It will carry a long way. So we employ that self control. I forgot the second part of your question, Louise. You had asked me,
So
whether it's convince or what I was going to say is, the biggest mistake we made is to problem solve too quickly. It's particularly problematic in the military and law enforcement. I can show up at a situation and I can listen to the demands of the inmates, or I can listen to the demands of the right wing militia. I know exactly what we're going to have to go through, and I know exactly what they're ultimately going to accept. But knowing that doesn't mean I can make it happen on my schedule. I could show up and say, listen, you guys are being a horse's ass, and we're going to talk for 3 days, and you're going to get all kinds of demands, and you're going to think you're tough and you're empowered. Eventually, I'm going to wear you down. You're going to realize you don't have much power, and then you're going to accept 3 days from now or 4 days from now what I've already offered you. Now, I can say all that, but that's not going to do me any good. In fact, it might actually alienate them. So, knowing what has to be done, you've got to be careful that you don't rush to play those cards and to try to initiate those steps till you've earned the right to do so. So, you have to really work at slowing yourself down and being patient and letting things evolve. Another thing that comes up a lot of times when I would advise police departments on particularly a troublesome situation, I would say, "Well, have you tried this?" And they say, "Well, we tried that yesterday. It didn't do any good." I said, "Well, that was yesterday. You know, today's a different day. That person has had 24 hours of thinking and behaving and responding to what's going on, not only what we've said, but what they see, what internal stresses they have. So because it didn't work yesterday doesn't mean it won't work today." So we just have to be patient in kind of developing a strategy for being empathic and listening to someone. And I know it works. So, yeah, so I would worry less about convincing. And we're all guilty of it. My wife will absolutely laugh if she hears I go around the world teaching listening skills, you know, but more often than not, particularly in a marriage, our wives don't want us to solve their problems. They just want us to understand their issues and concerns. And we have a tendency, some of us in our personalities, having been in law enforcement, the military, boom, I got it. Here's what you need to do. Boom,
yeah,
do
yeah,
this, problem's done. And that's the way our minds think. And we can maybe remove the emotional aspect of it and get right down to, okay, what needs to be done. But that's not what that person, that spouse needs right now from us. They have to be shown, and we have to prove we understand what they've been through and how they feel about it. Remember, it's not what happens to us in life, it's how we feel about it.
And
As
the feeling
as a
part is
cons-
the influencing part, correct?
yeah, I mean, as a consultant, I occasionally work with companies that were uh, getting ready for a big layoff and letting people go. A very unpleasant time in a small town, and this is employing hundreds of people, and you got to let half of them go, or maybe the whole plant's closing down. Well, the people that avoid trouble are the ones who are empathic, have prepared. All right, folks, there's no way we can deliver this as good news, but we want to make clear you all have a packet of information. These are the health benefits that will continue for you. This is the office we're setting up to help you with job placement. This is how we're going to bridge, this, that, or the other thing. And they won't be happy about what happened. They might be angry, but they probably won't act out because even they can tell that you have taken, above and beyond steps to make this transition as less uncomfortable as possible. Uh, and there's other companies that just say, you noticed all the policemen here in the auditorium? That's because you're all fired. Goodbye. And that's a recipe for problems.
So words matter, right?
Absolutely.
I have a whole bunch of
Absolutely.
scribbles here, and I wrote words matter. So I wanted to get your take on that. So I want to switch more into the leadership side of the
Sure.
conversation here. So as a leader, I think what I'm listening here is that you have to be able to essentially, if you have bad news, there's a way to actually deliver the news, and there's a good way to actually deliver a good way and a bad way to deliver the news, and also how you say it as well is a very important part. And obviously, from your side of the fence, in the book, in all the cases that you're speaking about, that was highly important then, and it's still highly important now, irrespective of where you are, even if you are an entrepreneur, an FBI agent, or a business owner, right? That words matter.
Well, they do. And they matter more than solutions if you want to know the truth. I mean, even as a
That's interesting.
manager,
Yeah.
people in the FBI, um, I didn't have to solve someone's problem as often as you might think. But what I always had to do was listen to them. And at the end of the day, that worker, that spouse, that subordinate wants to have a clear and unambiguous sense that you understand what the issue is for them and how they feel about it. They don't necessarily expect you to solve it. They just want to make sure you understand. You know, when you sent that guy on that trip overseas, you may not have realized it, but I'm the one that first talked to them about that. I expected to go on that trip. And I'm really upset that I didn't get the chance to go on that trip. Well, you might say, well, that's too bad. I make the decisions around here. Wrong, wrong, wrong. What you say is, you know what? I think you're probably right. I don't think I appreciated the fact that we're in on the early stages of that. And I probably didn't give that as much thought as I should have. And I apologize for that. I can't bring that trip back, but I'll do everything in my power to make sure that what you would consider to be a next great travel opportunity to do what we do, I will put you first in line and I'll make sure you get that opportunity. That's all I can do. I can't bring back the past. That's what they want to hear, you know. And sometimes they're just dead wrong. And you have to say, okay, I appreciate what you're saying, but I sent him to Paris because he speaks French and you don't. That's the criteria I used. And you
Mhm.
may not appreciate that, but the legal attache over there told me that it was very important that whoever we sent speak French. So that was the basis of my decision. So if you have a good explanation, that's fine. You can have disagreement, but that person owes it to hear what your thinking was. And if your thinking was a mistake, live up to it. I mean, I wish our politicians on the national scale these days would learn some of these things. It's like they're completely oblivious to it. It's okay to make mistakes. People understand. You don't have to argue everything you did was perfect and you've never made a mistake and it's always somebody else's fault. That's just a recipe for losing trust. It just
Yeah,
is.
yeah. Nobody's perfect, and I think
No.
I think we all learn from mistakes. It makes us stronger, and especially for us politicians. I'm not a politician, but I'm assuming that you want to be honest with people. Say, hey, I've screwed up in the past. Here's how I screwed
Yeah.
up. Maybe it'll resonate with some people. Who knows?
Yeah. I've listened to some again, I don't want to get into politics, but I listened to some of Governor Cuomo's press conferences recently, and one of the things I liked about it, he said, is if you want to get mad at somebody for closing the schools, don't get mad at the school board, don't get mad at the city council. It was my decision. Blame me. Now, here's why I made that decision. Here's what my thinking was. You may not agree with it, but this is what I'm trying to do. It becomes really difficult to get mad at somebody when they're taking and they're giving you a full explanation as to why they did something. And they're also giving you permission to disagree with them if you don't like that decision. But they're saying, here's why I did it, and here's why I would do it again. And I appreciate the fact that that would not be well received by a lot of people, but it's the decision I made.
So it sounds that it was a refreshing sound for you to hear that from Governor Cuomo. And if it was a refreshing sound, I'm trying to draw a parallel into your book, because from a leadership perspective, again, I don't want to play armchair quarterback. I don't want to throw names into the mix. Uh, but I found that another part of the book that I found really fascinating was reading it as a case study. Because I went through, as I mentioned before when I introduced myself to you, I went through an MBA program at the Ohio State University, and we studied leadership a lot. And Jordan, I believe it was the case where at this point now you have a different leadership uh, manning the scene, I guess, and helping you out to say, hey, you want to stall for time, go for it. We're not rushing this. We're not shooting from the hip. And I've worked in different roles before where I've had managers shoot from the hip, and it's just like, dude, why are we doing this? This is not the right thing. But you know what? Let's just roll with it because you are the boss, and you do want to shoot from the hip. And then the results are not exactly the optimal results. And I'm saying that because when we compare that to other situations where we had and I want to say the name, but I kind of want to respect the privacy of other folks. But hey, the name is in the book anyways. The leadership that was there in the Waco situation was a little bit different than what happened in Jordan, right? Where it was just, Gary, let's not remove you, but let's relieve you from the duty. Let's put somebody else in there. And I think at that point, when that decision was made, you were probably cautious. Let them know that, hey, this is not probably the right thing to do. But yet again, you followed orders, right? I want to make sure that I am putting that in the correct context here,
Essentially, yes. I mean, what I think a good leader has to do, no matter how high you've advanced within your organization, is if it's a large, complex organization, you can't possibly know everything there is to know.
for sure.
And what makes you a good leader is you take in good information, you listen to people that know what they're doing, they have experience, and then you make your decision. It may ultimately be counter to what your experts say, but you've given them an opportunity to fully explain this is why we do things a certain way. And yes, that was, in one sense, in Waco, I was allowed to express my opinions freely, but the on scene commander there also listened to very strong opinions from the tactical commander and basically approved both of us doing our things without fully appreciating that those things were contradictory and
Yeah,
unintentionally uh, the aggressive tactical actions thwarted progress in negotiations. In Montana, 3 years later, an even longer siege of 85 days, having learned or relearned, I should say, those lessons from Waco, the director of the FBI in a conference call says, Gary, show us how we should do this. I'm in no rush for this to end. I want it to end the right way. And that was an expression of his confidence that he had good expertise working under him, had listened to the approach we suggested, and found it reasonable and appropriate and worthy of support. And that was the word. And it changed the entire situation. And sadly, that could have been the case at Waco, but it wasn't. Different set of leaders, different director of the FBI, any number of factors involved. But I think if you look at it in general, you don't want 1,000 voices taking forever and getting analysis paralysis. However, a good leader should identify key people that have input and knowledge and experience that can contribute to the resolution of the problem, whatever it might be. Listen to those people, uh, take in, ask appropriate questions, ensure you understand why they are recommending you do certain things or make certain decisions, and then make the best decision you can and stick with it and support it. That's the mark of good leadership in a crisis. And I think you will find. Well, there's a quote that starts one of my chapters from one of my favorite all-time authors, Rudyard Kipling, and it says, it's a partial quote that says, "If you can keep your head about you when all else are losing theirs." And I love that quote because you see in a crisis the best and the worst in people. You absolutely do. There's people that you thought were pretty squared away, and they get in a crisis and they fold like a card table because they can't handle the stress. There's other people who are maybe quiet and you didn't recognize this incredible, strong leadership core that they had, and all of a sudden they rise.
They rise to
Uh,
the top. Yeah.
they rise to the top and show that they can be relied upon to make good, thoughtful decisions and based on a rational consideration of the facts and circumstances and not allow their emotions to cloud their judgment. So you see both the good and the bad in people. It's been my experience that those who can maintain that self control that I mentioned earlier and who are open to the ideas and suggestions of others will be successful. I always talk about in Waco, I don't even remember which negotiator it was, but at one point early on, one of the brand new negotiators, he didn't have much experience, but he was trained and he was there, um, suggested, why don't we videotape these children in the child protective home and send the videotape in to show the parents? And as soon as I heard it, I said, this is the most brilliant thing I've ever heard in my life. Of course, I said, well, I was just going to say that. No, of course not. No, but I
Did you
told him, I
say that?
said, that is such a great idea. And no one, I mean, everybody, as soon as we all heard it, it was like, wow, you know, what a great approach to take here. And we did it, and it was successful. It did yield some very positive results. Unfortunately, of somewhat limited nature because of other things. But to create an atmosphere of decision making where a new person sitting amongst grizzled old, very senior negotiators with gray hair and wrinkles, and you know, to feel comfortable enough to voice an opinion, to make a suggestion. I was probably more proud of that than anything else, that this young fella had the uh, the comfort level to be able to express this idea, and we all benefited from it because of that atmosphere that had been created. That's what I think good leadership is about.
That's awesome. Yeah, because I know that sometimes some leaders make an atmosphere where, you know, please don't say anything. We got this. We've been here for 20, 25 years, whatever it is, or even 5 years. And I think that's ineffective, I think, in a way, because one of the things that I love about entrepreneurship is that you're flexible, you're nimble, you could just try and retry different things. Like I think something you said before is that you tried it yesterday, it didn't work. Well, why not try it again? I know sometimes I think Einstein was the one who said that if you try it again and again and again, it's insanity. But in these type of
Well,
situations,
there's another question I used to get all the time from, happened at Waco. It happened in almost every situation where a police official will say, "You're recommending we do this," and the question I have is, "What do we get out of it?" And I said, The more important question is, what do we lose? What do we give up? Do we really give up anything, or is this just our egos not wanting to look weak or that we've made a concession? We're trying to build a relationship of trust. If we can do something positive for this person, we are likely to further that effort and to not only say we care about them and want to help them, we're demonstrating it, we're showing them. And if they don't follow through, and sometimes they don't, we can say, you remember yesterday we did this for you? Didn't ask for anything back, or you said you'd do something and you didn't do it. Okay. But I just want you to know we've been doing everything within our power to show you that we're here to help you. Really would help me if you could show me something that I could take to my boss and show that you're somebody that we can work with.
Hmm.
That sort of thing. So you have to think not about getting even, but getting your way,
Hmm. Hmm.
succeeding in the goal that you have to resolve the situation peacefully.
A couple more questions, if you don't mind, sir.
Sure.
Um, Not questions, but statements, I guess, in a way. Show of force. Show of force. That's something that something else that obviously is in your book, and as a negotiator, or just in any conversation you're having with people, um, show of force could be detrimental, or if it could be necessary at the time. And I'm speaking about this because now I'm kind of diving into the what we are living in America from a social perspective, if you don't mind me kind of switching gears a little bit, where now that we have guidelines from the CDC that hey, we have to wear masks and yada yada yada, and you have people on the front lines right now doing the best they can to keep our the grocery stores healthy, our grocery stores intact, and our customers healthy. And then you have unfortunate individuals that there are security guards or whatnot, or just people that are doing their job and saying, "Hey, may you please, you know, put on a mask or whatnot." And the opposite is happening, right? Where they're probably doing their job, but then you see the show of force from individuals, right, where they're attacking them. I guess from your perspective, how, that's a difficult this situation to manage because that's already happening, right? Um, but if you are
If
the manager,
if you're in the military or particularly law enforcement in the context of your question, um, and we tell somebody to do something or not do something, we'll almost always use verbal skills to try to bring about that cooperation.
yeah.
With some police officers, some police leaders, if people don't comply as quickly or efficiently or as fully as we want, we take it personally. We get angry
Mm,
and we're going to say, no, I asked you nice and now I'm going to show you. We overreact. Um, Now, there's some unpleasant situations police face. There's riots and, you know, demonstrations of violence that have to be dealt with a little bit more harshly. But typically speaking, force has to be used very, very carefully. In a bank hostage situation, we want the bank robber to look out and see there's police officers with weapons and a SWAT team. We don't have to threaten him with it. We don't have to say, if you hurt a hostage, these guys are going to come in and kill you. He knows we're there.
yeah, they
It,
they
there's
they could
there,
they could deduce it.
there's an implied there's an implied equation. Deal with the nice man on the phone, the negotiator, or deal with the big guys with the guns. That's all we have to say. We contrast the benefits of cooperation with the risks of resistance. Now, in other situations, and the primary reason for police to show up with a demonstration of power on a perimeter is the number one responsibility of making sure that the incident does not spread elsewhere and endanger the public. So we have to contain it.
Mhm.
But let's say we have somebody that's threatening to kill his wife and children. He has no demands. He just wants us to go away. It may be appropriate in many instances if we can have a reasonable level of safety on the perimeter to make sure nobody goes in and he doesn't sneak out and shoot somebody else. The more we can step back and be less in your face, less aggressive appearing, the better that is for the efforts of the negotiators to try to create that relationship of trust that we talked about earlier. So, negotiations is not just what you're saying over the phone, it's what the person sees when they look out the window. So, everyone on the police department has to convey the same basic message. We're not here to ruin your day. We're not here to come in and shoot you up. You know, and if they ask you, why are those guys out there with guns? I said, well, we didn't know what was going on. There was shots fired, and it's our duty to keep the public safe. You sound like a reasonable guy to me, and I'm sure we can get this resolved, and these officers can go home and not be a concern to you anymore. But right now, we have to make sure that you and everyone inside is safe. That would be the approach that you would take to kind of explain that you have to have a footprint there, but that presence is not intended to be aggressive and offensive against him. I hope that answers you.
It does. Now, I hope I could ask this question. So we've seen pictures on the media where some individuals have either stormed a courthouse. I think it was Michigan, and also in Georgia with two different situations, right? One in Michigan with the governor because of the lockdown situations, and here you have still images of pretty much the on the left hand side police officers just pretty much just holding manning the fort, the perimeter. And you have American citizens just pretty much just expressing themselves. Um, and on the other side of the fence in Georgia, you have this individual that was shot by two different civilians. And some of the community also went over to the to I think it was the sheriff's department or the governor's house mansion to pretty much protest as well. So two different like situations where I think the question here is basically if you were able to have a conversation with the governors or any other governors, because I know that in the book you speak about some situations where you've held you pretty much had negotiated with some militias, right? So I guess one of the questions that I had is, will this happen again? As far as another holding somewhere else, and then I see as I'm reading the book, I'm seeing this image of individuals storming the courthouse, and it's just like, wait a second. Luckily, they didn't breach the law enforcement perimeter and held the governor hostage here, right? Because I was reading the book and I'm just forward thinking about the risks there, and I was like, hell, maybe this could be a question that I could ask Gary, and he'll be okay with me asking. If so, what would how can a governor or yeah how can a governor prepare in advance to be able to uh you know get out of a sticky situation like that where now even the police officers can't control that perimeter like you mentioned.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think the whole issue of guns has become a political hot potato, and people feel the Second Amendment allows them basically carte blanche to do what they want. I support the Second Amendment with
so do
limitations.
so do I,
You know,
yeah.
I don't believe anyone should own an assault weapon, and I know your listeners will call it, "Oh, it's not an assault weapon." Whatever. We know what a battlefield designed weapon is. You do from the Marine Corps. But be that as it may, I feel as though someone's right to bear arms should not be allowed to be used in what should otherwise be a peaceful protest. If you're there to peacefully exercise your constitutional rights and protest some governmental decision, whether it's from the governor or the legislature, fine, that's great. When you carry weapons in like that, and I think first and foremost endanger police officers and intimidate uh, elected representatives from performing their duties and doing their business. I just think that's wrong, and I don't think it should be allowed. And I don't think it's a violation of the Second Amendment to limit that kind of activity. That's me. I'm sure will be plenty of people that disagree with it, but I just, well, I'll give you an example. There's a lot of fear in our country now, and I don't know why. I was in a Home Depot, one of my first, you know, post-COVID trips outside. I was at a home Lowe's actually a week ago, and there's a guy walking around with a gun on. And, I figured he's just a regular citizen in there and he's exercising his rights. I'm uncomfortable with that. I just, I don't know why. We live in a very rural area. It's not like we're a hotbed of robberies and assaults. And maybe it's his right to do so, but I don't think it makes sense. I'll tell you this. If I was at a fast food place with my two young grandsons who are visiting me now, and a guy walks in and he's got an AK-47 over his shoulder and he's wearing camouflage garb, I don't care if he's exercising his rights or not. I'm getting my grandchildren up and I'm leaving the restaurant immediately.
Your
I
situation
don't
awareness is heightened.
I don't know if he's a good guy with a gun. I don't know if he's a friggin' nut job that's pissed off and going to start shooting people. I don't know. And I shouldn't have to be in that position to wonder about that. So
Yeah.
that's my take on it. People disagree, fine, but that's how I view it. Because
No,
I
I
guarantee you, I would think if as a grandparent I did not do that, then I would be irresponsible.
listen. I wrote a book. I think I mentioned this to you. It's called Your Options: Proactive Thinking in an Uncertain World, and that's one of the chapters that I speak about. Is exactly what you just displayed right there. That it's all on situational awareness, and I think your situational awareness just got heightened in that hypothetical situation you just demonstrated. Um, but yeah, that's a lot of again, we could take this conversation, this topic, and have a whole
Yeah, and
different episode.
I don't know your listener demographic, but I'm sure there's people out there that
Oh,
will hear this that are just totally aghast with my talk about infringing on their right to do whatever they want. But in society, it's the old saying about your right to yell fire ends at the movie theater. Your right to throw a punch ends at the end of my nose. I mean, there's a lot of things we all collectively have to accept as limitations on our behavior for the common good. And I just think that's important. And I'll leave you this one long thing. I think if there was 100 men of color that showed up in the Michigan State House with those weapons on their shoulders, the state police would have been called in to take very harsh methods to remove them. And I'm sorry, people can say, well, I don't think that's the case. I know that's the case. It absolutely would have happened. And that's wrong.
I'm speechless right now, but yes, I agree with you as well. Um, so again, last question, sir, if you don't mind me asking. A lot of great cases here, a lot of great leadership feedback, I think. And I know that I could have sat here for the past hour and a half and discussed Waco with you. To be honest with you, I have not even seen the Waco miniseries. I'm sorry. I think this is good enough. One day I'll sit down and watch it. If you could speak about without breaching any top secret information or clearances, whatnot, what cases could you have put in here that were not put in here that would pretty much fulfill some of the topics that we discussed here from a leadership perspective? Things that you could do ahead of time for negotiation, things that you've learned. Hmm, sorry.
I tried to pick out the cases that best illustrated the points that I was trying to make. My personal journey, the evolution of negotiations in the country, and to be an advocate for its efficacy. Um, I delivered twice as many cases to Random House as ended up in the book. So they
Oh.
didn't, yeah, they wanted 85,000 pages, 85,000 words. I gave them 170,000 words. So a lot of things had to be cut because, how many prison riots do you talk about? How many hijackings do you talk about? Whatever. So we tried to limit those to what they thought the length of reader that reads this kind of book. And so there's a lot more stories, but I don't think I left anything out, you know, relevant to negotiations that was classified. There's some stuff I did on the terrorism and foreign counterintelligence side that I didn't discuss, but I'm not sure that they would have made it in the book anyway. But let me make a comment, as this is the last question. I should have commented before. For
Yes,
those
sir.
who have seen or will see the Netflix Waco show, it was based in part on my book. And I stand by the depiction of the FBI part of uh, what happened. There are no shortage of dramatic license and Hollywood depictions in that. However, the basic premise about the conflict within the FBI about tactics versus negotiations is accurately reflected. They also used the book of David Thibodeau, a surviving Branch Davidian, and David and I got along fine on the set, and we actually spoke on the phone a few days ago. But we have a different perspective and a different take on things, and I think he would say the same thing to you. And I think although they were trying to show a balanced look at both sides, outside looking in, inside looking out, I think they ended up painting far too sympathetic of a character in David Koresh. In real life, he was darker, more manipulative, more sinister, certainly engaged in much broader child predatory behavior, sexual exploitation than depicted. They make the question of who started first the fire between ATF and the Davidians. They make it look like ATF did. There's evidence that suggests otherwise. I don't know. I wasn't there then. They leave the impression that the FBI started the fire. The Danforth Commission, the most comprehensive examination of what happened at Waco, clearly establishes that the Davidians started the fire. So there's some inaccuracies there. I stand by what's in my book. If somebody wants to know what I really said about what happened at Waco, then it's the largest chapter in my book, and I would recommend they read that. There's other sources. There's been a number of, this is a dramatic series on Netflix. There's also some documentaries. CNN did a really good one a few years ago called Faith Fire. What's it? Faith Fire, and I can't remember the other name now. But anyway, it's quite good. People can go on my website, www.garynoesner.com, and there's links to most of those prior documentaries and articles, interviews I've done, other podcasts. So if they're interested in Waco and finding out more, and that's one of my big complaints about people in general today, we don't seem to dig into complex issues and learn a variety of facts. The typical person, it seems to me, either feels that they're a bunch of crazy cult people and they deserve what they got, and that's not completely true, or that the big old FBI comes in and says, let's kill everybody, and that's obviously nonsense. Mistakes were made on both sides, decisions good and bad, a lot of good work. It's both the proudest and day of my work of my FBI career, and also the thing I'm the most affected by. But like most things in life, again, it's complex, it's nuanced. If you want to understand it, dig, learn, read from a variety of different sources. See if you get a good handle on what you think really happened.
Definitely. Listen, sir, it's been an honor having this conversation, and you've done a lot of Again, I could have this I think I have like four different episodes with you here, because multitasking was another thing too that I didn't get to ask you here. But um, I just want to say thank you so much for giving me your time, and I appreciate you coming on board. Is there anything else that you would like to leave the listeners for with from a from a leadership perspective? You I think you would have been a great leader to work with. That's all I have. That's all I can say here.
Well, it's very, very kind of you. Uh, I would just say to really work at, there's a lot of active listening skills, but if you want to be good at this, really focus on, I would say two things: emotion labeling and paraphrasing. In emotion labeling, when I hear somebody's upset, angry, confused, bewildered, say it. You sound angry. You seem confused. I can hear disappointment in your voice.
Hmm.
And when you do that, it is a very powerful way of conveying what I mentioned earlier. I understand how you feel about something. Paraphrase, and in the larger context, a summary, allows you to use your own words to feed back to somebody what I've heard. So, Louise, you were a Marine Guard, and you worked in embassies around the world. You were in Moscow and some other interesting places. You had some great training that showed you how to deal with people that walked up and were angry at our country. And it took a lot of finesse and training, but you were very proud of having that opportunity to do that and to serve our country. If I get that right, and
Which
hopefully
you
I
did.
did,
You did.
it's powerful. It's powerful. You say, oh, he really listened to me, and not only did he listen to what my experience was, or a little bit of my experience, but he also picked up on how I felt about it, how proud I was of it, you know? And when you do those things with not just business associates, but neighbors, friends, certainly your family, man, that's powerful stuff. So that's the note I'll leave you with.
All right, sir. That's something definitely I'll emotional labeling and paraphrasing for sure.
Yeah.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, again, Gary Noesner. Stalling for Time: My Life as an FBI Agent. You can pick it up. I picked this book up in Barnes and Noble. I think it was the easiest. You want to get this hard copy, I believe. But
Well, I
Gary,
don't think they're printing hard copies anymore. I think they're just down to paperbacks now.
oh,
But Barnes and Noble has it. Amazon is currently out of stock, but I'm told they're getting it back in any day now. We'll see.
let's
It's
see.
also on ebook and audiobook, which I read. So
All right, awesome, sir. Thank you so much. It's been a blessing. And